Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and today I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we talk about issues surrounding all the different kinds of fuel that power American business and American life and all the things that we want and need to do. And so we also talk about all the different things that use that fuel. Again, both at work but also at home. That means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is really intended for everybody. And so with that in mind, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Many of the folks in our audience have something to do with stored fuel in their professional lives. Lots of different kinds of businesses, lots of industries, they keep stored fuel around in some capacity because they need it. Police stations, fire stations, utilities, telecoms and data centers are big ones, hospitals and healthcare facilities, obviously fleets, and then also don't forget agriculture and farming. These areas are all big ones when it comes to the role that stored fuel plays in helping them do what they need to do. And we are coming out of the winter, heading into the spring where the temperatures are warming up, and so the focus for these operations managers that manage these fuels, that focus is really shifting away from how do I keep cold weather gelling problems from happening in my fuel to now how do I keep other things from happening in my fuel so that I don't have problems in the spring and in the hot summer months, right? So all these users, they're thinking about that kind of thing. They all keep stored fuel around in some fashion because they need it. Many of them keep it around as, say, emergency backup fuel. Depending on the scenario, that fuel, that stored fuel that they have, that can sit in storage for, could be relatively long periods of time. Could be a year, could be 2 years, maybe more, sitting in there waiting to be used. On the other end of the spectrum, though, you've also got people, and this is especially true when you're talking about private fleets and also what we call retail fuel distributors. These folks are on the opposite other end of the spectrum. They store fuel, but they don't keep it around for years or even months. Their fuel tends to move in and out of the storage tank almost as fast as they can get it in there, right? Think about truck and bus fleets that fill up every day. The bus goes around town, does its routes, comes in at the end of the day, fills up from a central fuel storage tank at that installation so that it's ready to go for the next day. And that kind of place, that place goes through fuel really quickly. The fuel that they have in that fuel storage tank is not going to be sitting in there for very long. It's going to be used up pretty quickly. It's not uncommon for a gas station to get at least a couple of fuel drops a week. And you can get a truck stop that happens to be pretty busy. They'll get a fuel delivery a day, maybe multiple fuel drops a day when they're really busy, right? Those users are considered quick turn or high turn fuel users because the fuel doesn't sit in the tank for very long. It gets used up pretty quickly. So today what we want to do is we want to tackle one of the biggest myths in fuel storage. And it's a myth that has to do with differences between this low-turn fuel and this high-turn fuel. We're talking about the idea that microbial problems are not a concern in high-turn fuel storage tanks. It's well known that when you have stored fuel and it sits in a tank, a storage tank for months or years, long-term stored fuel, it's well known that kind of fuel has a relatively high risk of eventually developing microbial contamination. But can you say the same thing about quick turn fuel? Is the same thing true about fuel that goes into the tank and then gets used up, going out of the tank in a matter not of months or years, but days or weeks? Is it also true about that kind of fuel? And the thing is, many fuel professionals assume that quick turn fuel just doesn't sit in the tank long enough to develop microbial problems. After all, the fuel's always being used and being replaced by new fuel on a relatively constant basis. How could microbes have time to grow in that fuel? Well, That assumption that you don't need to worry about microbial problems in that kind of fuel, that assumption is a lot more wrong than you might think. So today we're going to explain why quick-turn fuel is not immune to microbial contamination. In some cases, we're going to see how quick-turn fuel can actually cause situations which accelerate microbial spread. So let's dive into this. Now, before we get into the nuances of quick-turn versus slow-turn fuel, let's talk about who actually uses these kinds of stored fuel and why maintaining that or protecting that fuel's quality is so important to them. We already briefly went through these when we were rattling off the list of people that use stored fuel. So hospitals and healthcare facilities, virtually all of these will have emergency backup generator systems. They're required to have those. And those systems need clean, viable, in-spec diesel fuel so that they can be sure to function if something happens like a power failure. Police and fire stations, these all will typically have on-site fuel reserves so that they can keep their operations and their operation centers, their vehicles, operational again, if an emergency happens. Data centers and telecom, these rely on backup fuel, very important for their backup fuel to be there to prevent business downtime and to keep their servers running. Data centers is one of those markets that is just growing and growing and growing. Number of data centers across the countries is, I think, projected to increase by 4 times in just within the next 5 years. And that's because of the growth of things like AI. And so 4 times more data centers is going to mean 4 times more backup fuel and 4 times more potential of developing microbial problems that need to be managed and controlled. And then, of course, since we mentioned telecom, think about all the cell towers that you see all across the fruited plain. Every single one of those cell towers has a backup generator that has a fuel storage tank, that has fuel in it that needs to be maintained because, again, they can't afford to go down. They have to ensure that they're online. And so there's a lot of stored fuel for those kind of operations. Trucks and bus fleets, already mentioned those. Already mentioned, in fact, many large fleets will maintain these large on-site bulk fuel storage tanks so that they can have easy refueling of those vehicles. And then another one we also mentioned, gas stations and retail fuel distributors. These are the facilities that are probably the prototypical examples of quick-turn fuel. They will cycle through high volumes of fuel constantly. They have to, and that's their business model, right? So again, not uncommon for them to get 1 or more fuel drops a day, right? Depending on how quickly the fuel gets used up, it's either going to be low-turn fuel or high-turn fuel. Low-turn fuel, more specifically, is considered to be fuel that sits in storage for multiple months. And then, of course, that can go all the way up to years, but it's at least multiple months of time. And we say it sits in there without frequent use. Now, what we mean by that is that doesn't mean that they never use any of it. What they mean is that they use it really slowly. And this can happen on farms a lot. Many farms, especially the smaller operations, not uncommon to find a fuel storage tank with fuel that's 5 years old, right? Because they just haven't had the need to use all of it. But they still definitely have the need to keep it around. And then you have high-turn fuel. That's fuel that goes into a storage tank and is intended to be moved out pretty quickly. Not talking about multiple months. We're talking about days or a handful of weeks. And again, already discussed that this is the model that retail fuel distributors, gas stations, and truck stops use. So, low-turn and high-turn fuel. Most professionals understand that low-turn fuel, remember the fuel that's sitting in there for a long period of time, they understand that low-turn fuel that sits in storage for longer periods of time is inherently more at risk for developing microbial problems. Okay, we're not going to dispute that. But there's a concurrent belief from the same people that on the opposite side, the quick turn fuel is, shall we say, too temporary to develop microbial problems. And that belief is where the mistake happens. The logic behind it's understandable, though, right? Microbial contamination inherently tends to develop over a period of time. The more time you have, the greater chance that you give for microbes to grow and develop a contamination situation. But the logic goes, quick turn fuel doesn't stay in the tank very long, so microbes don't have the time needed to grow. Okay, if you stop there, it sounds reasonable, right? The problem, though, and this is where we start to kind of chip away at this mistaken logic. The problem is that fuel turnover by itself does not eliminate microbial contamination, because the issue isn't just the fuel. The issue is also with the tank and the storage system itself. And when we say that, we say quick turn fuel is not immune from developing microbial contamination problems, because these kind of problems, the chance of these kind of problems developing does not solely rest on how long the fuel's in the tank. It doesn't matter. The chance of problems developing does not rest simply on the fact that the fuel gets used up and keeps getting changed quickly. It matters more that the tank itself does not change. So we're going to unpack that principle a little bit. So think about this. Microbial contamination in a fuel storage tank. Where is that microbial contamination, right? Microbial contamination is not just in the fuel. Microbes don't just stay in the fuel and float around and live just there. Microbes in a storage tank actually like to establish themselves in multiple different kinds of places. And one of those places is all the solid surfaces that they have access to. So think about a fish tank, right? If you have an aquarium, or if you've ever had to manage an aquarium, you know that algae, which is a type of microbe, algae will grow on the glass and the filter and the surfaces in that inside the tank. And what you'll find is that even if you change that water every single day, algae is still going to grow on that glass, on that filter, on those surfaces. Same type of thing happens in fuel storage tanks, except we're not talking about algae, because algae doesn't grow inside a storage tank, because algae needs the light to grow, but that's another show. Instead, we're talking about bacteria, mold, fungi. Same thing happens with them in fuel storage tanks. They will grow and live in two main places in stored fuel situations. First one is the fuel-water interface. Remember that water's heavier than fuel, so water built up on the bottom, fuel, the lighter fractions, is on top, and microbes do like to grow at the place where the two meet, because they have special close access to all the things that they need to grow and thrive. They've got moisture from the water on the bottom, and they have elemental nutrients from the hydrocarbons on top. And that's fine. But they don't just grow at the fuel-water interface. They also grow on the tank surfaces and the piping. And the reason they're able to do this is because microbes will form this biological material called a biofilm or biomass. They will form this as part of their metabolic processes, and this will start to build up and form in layers on these solid surfaces. And then what the microbes will do is they will actually live inside the layers of this biological matrix. So in a fuel storage tank that has a microbial contamination problem, you're not just going to find it at the fuel-water interface, you're also going to find it in all of that biomass and biofilm that is stuck to the solid surfaces inside of that fuel distribution system. And the important part that gets missed in a lot of this is that the fuel turnover that you have, fuel turnover itself does not remove microbial growth. Even if you were to get a new fuel drop, fresh fuel delivered every day or twice a week, whenever you have it, even if you have fresh fuel delivered frequently, the microbial contamination that has built up inside of that tank over a long period of time, it does not disappear when the new fuel comes in. Instead, what happens is that every time you get new fuel added, you get a new fuel drop. What happens is that stirs up the microbial contamination. It creates turbulence. That turbulence will kick up what's at the bottom of the tank. It will disturb the biomass formations that are on the solid surfaces. And so essentially, what used to be contained and kind of just hanging around, not wanting to be disturbed, what happens is that essentially gets kicked up and thrown throughout the entire tank. And so what you get is you get a whole bunch of microbes that now find themselves with the, shall we say, the enhanced ability to go out and go to other places of the tank and establish additional microbial colonies. And so in this sense, while the fuel itself might only be in the tank for a short period of time, that microbial contamination is still there and is going to get worse with each new fuel drop until or unless you do something about it. What are the consequences of ignoring this microbial contamination? Okay, if you have been a listener to this show, and hopefully all of you have listened to all the episodes before, for those of you who have, we thank you. But if you have listened to any of the episodes before that we've done on microbial contamination problems, you'll recognize some of these consequences. First consequence from a practical standpoint is clogged fuel filters. Microbial biomass can get caught in those filters. It'll block fuel flow and is a major reason why you can get no start and no run situations that develop in emergency backup systems, right? So clogged fuel filters, number one. Number two, tank corrosion damage to the tank walls and the components. This happens because of two main vectors, if you will. First of all, many species of microbes, especially ones like acid-producing microbes and sulfate-reducing microbes, they will, as the byproducts of their metabolism, they'll produce acids. They'll release acids, and those acids will then, over time, start to eat away at metal components. So that's one part of the story, this slow, steady corrosion damage from the acids that have been produced by the microbes. And those microbes don't go away after whether the fuel itself is moved out of the tank quickly or slowly. They're going to do what they're going to do regardless. But additional trouble comes in when you have these layers of biomass. And the reason is that these biomass layers are complex ecosystems of microbes. They are not just solid surfaces of stuff. They're actually layers that have lots of different pockets and stuff for stuff to build up and develop. And so, to make a long story short, what you'll get, if you have layers of biomass on a tank surface, you get a number of different kinds of corrosion that can happen simply from that biomass being there. So if you find evidence that you have biomass in your system, you need to get rid of it. Now, to be fair, these things that we're talking about, these development of corrosion damage, it's not something that happens overnight, right? But it is something where if you don't do something about it and you allow it to go on unchecked, it will eventually weaken and damage a tank or pipe system over time. And if you run like anything that resembles a critical fuel system, like an emergency backup system, something that absolutely has to work at any time when you need it, this is not a situation that you can afford to just let go. You need to do something about it. So, takeaway here broadly is these issues we're talking about can manifest themselves just as much in quick turn fuel situations as with slow turn or long-term storage situations. And so that leads us to ask the question, how do you stop microbial contamination before it becomes a problem, especially in quick turn tanks? Well, you might assume that quick turn tanks, right, the ones that see these regular fill-ups and drawdowns, Again, you might assume that they don't have time to grow microbial contamination, but as we've already seen, that's simply not true. Microbial contamination doesn't need the same fuel sitting in there undisturbed for months. Doesn't need that to develop. All it needs is water and opportunity. And that they're going to get that both in a quick turn and a slow turn situation. So here are a few quick points on how to stay ahead of these microbial problems. Step number 1 is you want to do regular fuel sampling. You do not want to wait for a shutdown to tell you that something's wrong. What you should be doing is sampling your stored fuel on some kind of regular interval basis. And when we say sampling, we're not just talking about taking a drain sample from a fill port. That's not necessarily going to tell you or give you a good picture of what's actually happening in your tank. Instead, you need to know what's happening at the bottom of your fuel tank, where the water and the microbes tend to be collected. In order to do that, what you need is what they call a fuel sampler, or you may have seen it referred to as a bacon bomb fuel sampler. So it's a long metal cylinder. You can lower it down to whatever height in the tank you need, and then you can draw a sample from whatever's around it at that depth. We typically recommend that you take a fuel sample from near the bottom of the tank. Never from the dead bottom of the tank, but typically about 3 to 6 inches. That typically is the area where if you can get a sample of what's around the sampler at that height, that's going to give you the most representative picture of what your fuel actually looks like. And so what are you going to be looking for? Well, you're going to be looking, first of all, you're going to be looking at its appearance. You're going to be looking to see if it looks abnormal. Has it changed color? You know what fresh, clear and by diesel fuel, whether it's dyed or undyed, you know what that should look like. Does it look like what it should look like? Does it have a lot of water in it? Is there a lot of sediment, a lot of funky biomass stuff that typically isn't supposed to be there? If you find evidence of that in just a sample that you're taking with a bacon bomb, you can be pretty sure that the reality in your tank is it's a lot worse than that. And so you now know something you didn't before, that you need to take action. And that's really important. Okay, step 2 is not only do you want to do fuel sampling, twice a year at a minimum, you want to do biannual microbial testing. Because even if your fuel sample looks fine, it looks clear and bright, it doesn't mean that you don't have microbial contamination growing in your system. So the way that you figure out if you have microbial contamination developing is you do a microbe test. Now, there are different ways that you can do a microbe test, different testing methodologies. The best one to use is what they call ATP by filtration. That's a test that measures microbial presence pretty directly, and it measures it pretty quickly, which means if you do one of those, you can get a pretty clear view on if you have problematic levels of microbes in your tank or not. And it also means that you can then decide if you need to take action. So that's step 2, biannual microbial testing. The third one is what you do if you find a problem or if you have reason to suspect that you have a problem, and that is you need to do water removal and you need to do biocide treatment. Now, this is where a lot of tanks, especially quick turn tanks, kind of fall short in their housekeeping protocols. Microbes do not need a lot of water in order to gain a foothold and develop a contamination situation. So if you have any detectable water in there, you want to get it out, and you want to do that as soon as you find it. How do you do that? Well, depending on where it is in the tank, you can either drain it from the sump, or you can use a water scavenging chemical that will essentially mop up the water that you can't find, that you can't get to, but that you have pretty reasonable certainty is in your tank, especially if you have a system that's got like baffles and things like that. Highly, highly likely that you've got pockets of water in there. And then if you did step 2, right, and you did that microbial testing, and that testing confirmed that you do indeed have microbial contamination, what do you do then, right? Well, what you need to do is you need to apply a biocide chemical treatment into your fuel. Now, this is very important to understand. There are chemicals out there that will talk, they're typically multifunction treatment chemistries, and they'll claim to do a whole bunch of different things, right? And it's very, very common for them to list off two particular things: controls water and removes or eliminates microbial contamination. Now, the reality is that simply removing the water out of a system will not eliminate microbial contamination. If microbial contamination is established in your tank, it will not go away simply if you remove the water. That is a myth that has been held over from multiple decades in the past. And with today's fuels, that simply is not true. But yet, a lot of people still believe that is a correct description of the reality when it's not. The only way for you to get rid of a microbial contamination problem is to use a biocide. And a biocide is a class of chemistries that have been designed to kill biological organisms, which is what microbes are. They are designed to kill microbes. Specifically, they're designed to kill the broad spectrum of the kinds of microbes that tend to be found in fuel storage systems. The thing that's really important to recognize with biocides is they're formulated to kill biological things, and as such, they are very highly regulated, and every legitimate biocide that's used in the industry, like in upstream oil and gas situations, for example, which use a lot of biocides, those are all EPA registered because the law says it has to be EPA registered. So make sure that you're using a biocide that is EPA registered for use in fuel, of which there's 5 or 6 good chemistries to choose from. And then after you've applied it properly and followed the directions, give it time to work, and then it's really a good idea to follow up with another round of microbial testing. So pull another sample and do a microbe test to verify that your microbial levels have been reduced from problematic to negligible. A good biocide will do that. It will do that relatively quickly. So that's the third thing that you want to do in this situation. So hopefully now you realize that if you manage quick turn fuels, you still have to worry about microbe problems. But there are good, proven industry practices that you can use to eliminate that problem so that it doesn't become a bigger and bigger one for you or, God forbid, for your customers. And so with that, that's going to wrap things up for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you again for joining us. As always, we will put links to things that we talk about in the show notes. And if you have not already, feel free to subscribe. Feel free to tell your friends. Subscribe at your podcast platform of choice, whether that's Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whichever one you like to use. And if you also are so inclined, feel free to leave us a good review because that really does help us a lot as well. So until next time, I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad. Thank you again for joining us. And we'll talk to you next time on the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.